Welcome back, this is CerealSnax. Today I'm continuing my series on Spectator tutorials about Starcraft II. My goal is really to educate those people who don't play Starcraft II but instead watch Starcraft II and therefore isn't necessarily interested in the mechanics or how things are done, but maybe more interested in what each unit does, what each building does, and then maybe later in the future a little bit more detail on all those things. So today I'm looking at Protoss Buildings. Last episode we looked at Protoss units, kind of what each unit did from a real high level view, and today I'm going to do the same with the buildings. So we're going to start with Protoss, and really the whole point of this episode is just to get you familiar with each building, what they look like, and when you see them being built by that player, what you can expect that player to be doing after they build that building. So without any further ado, let me get started here. And you can see the first building, I've got it highlighted with my green circle, is the Nexus. And the Nexus is like, it's the first building. You come with it by default. You can build more of them, obviously. But what it does is it allows you to create probes. It allows you to collect minerals and gas. So the probes then take those minerals and gas back to the Nexus. And that's really your center of operations. So the other thing it can do in terms of the Protoss is it can build a mothership, which is a really late game unit we discussed in the last episode. The special thing about the Protoss is that they have a chrono boost skill on the Nexus, which allows them to speed up their probe production if necessary. It also allows them to speed up production of other units and other buildings, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, the Nexus is the only building that the Protoss have that does not need to be powered by a pylon. So the pylon's the second building I'd like to talk about. The pylon for the Protoss allows those Protoss to not only gain more supply, which is very important to the game, how much supply you have up here in the top right, but it also allows the Protoss to build buildings within the radius of that pylon's energy field. The third thing it allows you to do is to warp in units within that energy field, which is very critical for Protoss. So if they happen to have a pylon near the enemy base, it's very useful in warping in units from into that location instead of having to create them through the barracks. So the third building we'd like to look at is the assimilator. And the assimilator can only be built on a gas geyser. Really the only purpose of it is to collect gas. So you can see I've got probes right now running in and out of that assimilator to collect that gas, which for the Protoss appears as little squares when they have it. You can see you can see the probes are carrying these little gas squares. They're also carrying their little minerals once they collect them. So, and there's an optimal number of probes that a pro player or any player really wants to have mining at any given time. Usually it's 2 per mineral patch, 2 probes per mineral patch, and you can get 3 probes into these gas geysers to really get your optimal collection. So let's move on to the fourth building. The fourth building is the gateway, and currently it's closed. So what that means, the top of it's closed. So from a spectator point of view, when it's closed like this, it means that the Protoss player has not yet researched warp gate, which allows them to warp in units. So that means when you create a unit here, it will come immediately out of that building, one at a time, and you can only queue up one at a time. So if you have multiple gateways, you can then, and what I'm going to do is I'll start training this and we can come back to it, but if you have multiple gateways, you can then warp in multiple units at a time. So let's look at the third building. Now, well, before we move to the third building, you can see it here, the transform to work gate option. That is what a lot of players will actually research very quickly. They'll use their cybernetics core, and they're kind of talking about both buildings at the same time, but the cybernetics core will allow them to research warp gate, which will then allow them to warp in units, which is really important for a Protoss player, and I've not seen a Protoss player neglect doing that at any certain time. And you can see it can build all the units, the ground units that the Protoss can do, the Stalker, or the Zealot, the Sentry, the Stalker, the Dark Templar, and the High Templar. So it's kind of your main base of operations. Many times you'll see Protoss build upwards of 8 of these or more by end game, so they can warp in 8 or more units at a time. Okay, so let's move on to the next building, the Forge. So the Forge is exactly what it says it is. It's a forge. It creates upgraded weapons. And you can see there's 3 weapons that you can create from the Forge. Your ground weapons, your ground armor, and your shields. And a lot of times Protoss players will actually build 2 of these by mid-game so that they can actually be training, because they get queued up, and I'll show you. when you're researching one ground weapon, the next one has to be queued up behind it. So if you have 2 buildings, you can then research both at the exact same time. So kind of a neat little, and the design of these buildings is really neat, especially for Protoss. Well, all of the races have really detailed designs. You can see it's kind of when it's operating, the lights are flying across it and the little ball is spinning. Same thing with this. I'll make a unit out of it. It starts to, little details like this are what make this game really kind of neat. You can see it's glowing and the warp gate is opening up, right? And I'll show you once this is trained what I can do with it. So but before then, let's move on to the 4th building. This is kind of the building we were talking about. This is the cybernetics core, and the main function of this, and a lot of times it's the 2nd building that's built after the gateway for Protoss, unless the Protoss is building the forge first, but that's more detail than we want to get into. It allows you to upgrade your air weapons and air armor. It allows you to research hallucination, which is used by the sentries, which is actually not that commonly used. And it trains your warp gate function. So speaking of the warp gate function, let's take a look back at here at the gateway. Now if I activate the warp gate function, now get this zealot out of the way. You can see it's opening up. It takes a different shape, looks a little different. What this allows you to do is actually to warp in a unit anywhere you want, or anywhere where there's a pylon. So I could zoom out here and I could warp in a stalker over here, and there he is. Greatly reducing your production time of your units. If you have multiple gateways, obviously you can warp in a bunch at the same time. Okay, let's move on to the next building, the robotics facility. So the robotics facility essentially allows you to build the observer, the warp prism, the immortal, and the colossus. So really the robotic units for Protoss makes sense, right? Let's see. So let's make a unit out of it just to show you. And the thing about the robotics facility that's a disadvantage compared to the gateway is obviously you can't warp in units with it. They actually create the units. So you're always going to have to queue up units to get them out. However, they're very expensive units anyway. And they're very powerful units, so it's not critical that you have a ton of these robotics facilities. In fact, I've never seen more than 2 built for a professional, but I'm sure it probably happens at some point in time. So it's making itself an immortal right now. Let's go on to the next building. So the next building I wanted to talk about is the Stargate, and the Stargate is really straightforward. It's just a building that makes your air units. So it warps in the Phoenix, warps in the Void Rays, and warps in a carrier. And again, just like the robotics facility, you can't warp in units at a pylon with this building. And you can see a little cactus here. I've never even noticed that before, sitting by the... Anyway, so that's the Stargate. Pretty straightforward, right? It builds you the air units. A lot of times you'll see players, if they're going heavy air, they'll build a bunch of Stargates. So, and by a bunch, I mean probably not more than 4 or 5, but at least so they can get multiple air units out at a time. And we'll just start one up, why not? Alright, let's go on to the next building. Next building is the Twilight Council. This allows you to not only get your forge to have better upgrades at some point in time, but it also lets you train charge for your zealots, which is a useful late game ability, and it also lets you research blink, which you'll hear a lot in professional games, any games that you're watching live stream. A lot of times blink stalkers is what they say. Blink stalkers. So stalkers with the blink ability. So that's something to keep on. In this Twilight Council also allows you to then build the Templar archives, which allows you to create Templar High Templar units. And then it also allows you to train the Psionic Storm for those High Templar units. In addition to that, you are then allowed they can then build the Dark Shrine. So a lot of times you'll actually see players who are playing Protoss versus Protoss or Protoss versus Zerg. Perhaps they will rush to get this Dark Shrine quickly. So what they'll do is they'll build their barracks, they will build their Twilight Council, Templar archives, and then immediately build their Dark Shrine, because that's the path they have to take. You have to do it in that order. So you have to build Twilight Council, Templar archives, and then Dark Shrine. And then they can build their Dark Templar, which of course are the stealth units I spoke about before. There's a carrier popped out. Okay, let's look at the next building I want to talk about is the Photon Cannon, and this is allowed to be built. This is actually a detector unit. It can see cloaked units. It's great for defense for Protoss. A lot of times it's not used early on in the game, although when Protoss are playing Zerglings, sometimes you'll see them throw down a photon cannon early just so they can defend themselves against an early Zerg rush. It can be built once you've built a forge. So I've probably left out some of the prerequisites for some of these buildings, but the photon cannon needs to have a forge built first. Let me go through some of the prerequisites before I end this video. The cybernetics core cannot be built. The cybernetics core cannot be built until the barracks is built. So once this building is built, then you can build this building. And the forge, it can be built right away, and so can the barracks. Now, once the cybernetics core is built, then you can build the advanced buildings like the robotics facility, the Twilight Council, and the Stargate. And then, of course, like I said, once you build the Twilight Council, you can then build the Templar Archives and the Dark Shrine. And I believe I have one more building that I forgot. Yep. After you build the Stargate, you then have the option to build the Fleet Beacon, which allows you to build carriers and also allows you to build a mothership at the main nexus. So I think that concludes my summary of all the Protoss buildings. I hope you found it informative. If you've been watching StarCraft II games and kind of wanted to know more about what's actually going on the screen, I know that the majority of people that watch StarCraft games have never played StarCraft before, so sometimes videos like this can be helpful because it gives them an idea of some more of what is going on. So please comment, subscribe. Hope you enjoyed. This is CerealSnax signing off.